So I'm Emma Fryer. I'm at ERM. For many years before that, I was at Tech UK. But most recently, I've got very interested in this Scope 3 conundrum, I think I'd call it. Recently, I helped with a document looking at Scope 3 for software companies and realised just how big a proportion of the carbon impact is bound up in Scope 3 for actually all companies, but particularly tech companies. I mean, I see it a bit like an old house. You know, I thought it looks straightforward in principle. It's a bit like you think you're putting your picture up, so you're putting your nail in the wall, and when you're putting your nail in the wall, a bit of the wall falls off, and then when you start filling the wall, a bit more of the wall falls off, and in the end, you have a really, really complicated, big problem that you didn't want in the first place. So I think that's how I see it. So I'm really interested in trying to find out more about how we tackle that and how, you know, what's essentially keeping everyone else awake at night in this.
Hi, my name is Maria Rivas. I work for Pure DC. So we construct and operate data centers for hyperscalers. So for us, this is a space of challenge and opportunity because we recognize the importance of transparency, but we also recognize that we can't be transparent just on our own. So opening the discussions, having those channels to understand, communicate, better bring data together is really interesting to us. And I guess the discussion today is almost opening the floor and understanding who can bring what type of information that allows everyone else to be more accurate. And it's also getting comfortable with the fact that the more accurate we get, the more emissions we may uncover. And that may be scary, but I think as an industry, transparency needs to be that, right? Uncovering what is uncomfortable, because Scope 1, I think, is quite comfortable for all of us. Scope 2, there's a little bit of challenges, but Scope 3 is really where I think at the moment we have a lot of question marks. So I'd invite everybody to be as open and probably as transparent as they can throughout the discussion today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lovisa Hagelberg. I work for a company called CBRE. I look after our Nordics business, but I'm also a sustainability champion within our company. And our part of the chain is we're a little bit everywhere. So we're in the building and operations part mainly, and we're the part of the supply chain when it comes to emissions. We're sometimes handling energy purchasing on behalf of our customers, and sometimes we do the entire environmental reporting. So we come across this in many different ways, and I have to really agree with Maria here. The maybe lack of transparency and the reluctance to share information has been an issue in our industry, and it's something that we need to all come together to work on that, to share information. And I think something that we've struggled with is that the more you report, the worse you look. So that's something we need to overcome. We need to be able to share this information without getting the blame for showing all of our Scope 3 emissions. So yeah, I'm also really looking forward to this conversation today. I think just looking around, we have a lot of diverse players in the industry that play different roles. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation.
Great, thanks, Louisa. So my name is Tom Moran. I'm going to talk about a few different things that I do. My day job is I'm a consulting principal for Lumen in EMEA, which was formerly CenturyLink, which was also formerly Level 3. Those of you will know was, you know, a good chunk of the internet backbone, basically. And in that role, I am primarily responsible for kind of technology strategy around digital disruption and digital transformation for businesses in Europe. But about 5 years ago, when I moved from the States to the US, it was my partner and I decided to create a social enterprise geared towards sustainability, education, and training. And in that 5-year time horizon, I've been focusing on research and education. So we bring students from the US to Europe and also from the UK, and we educate them on sustainability, whether they're studying things like civil engineering and urban planning, or sociology, or building data centers, or whatever it happens to be. What we don't do is ESG reporting education, right? We talk to people about actual sustainability, which I think is frankly fundamentally different. But obviously in that role, I've gotten involved in a lot of industry associations like the iMasons. I'm also a consultant to GeSI, which is the biggest telco industry or ICT industry sustainability organization has been around for about 15 years, and the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Association and Tech UK. And this has been a common theme and a common challenge. And in particular with GeSI, the telcos were kind of the first ones to address this issue. Pulling back the layers of the onion, you find out that there's just not a lot of consensus around how these things are supposed to work. And I think it applies both to Scope 2 and to Scope 3. So the effort that I was most recently part of with GeSI that I think kind of led to this was we worked with the ITU to come up with guidance for the telecommunications industry on Scope 2 and Scope 3 reporting. And that was a GeSI, ITU, GSMA document. And the ITU and GeSI decided, we'd like this document to be relevant to the data center industry, but we need to go out and sort of get their input. So I have a very specific agenda here, which is to get your input into what we hope will be Scope 3 guidance that extends from telecommunications into the data center space and frankly into other parts of IT. So software companies, application companies, and the kind of rest of that IT stack. So I hope this is a really interactive and an active conversation. So we're just going to walk through a few slides to kind of level set, just really making sure we're all at a kind of a shared understanding, right? So why do you care, right? What's the purpose, and why would you even go down the path of this thing that's clearly really complex and maybe more hassle than it's worth because it's maybe going to make you look worse than you did before you started? And really the reason is that key stakeholders, not just investors, but customers, in our case, it went from RFPs that said, oh, it would be really nice if you were sustainable, to we'd really like to see some numbers, to if you don't do this, we're going to find another supplier. And that happened over a period of just the last 3 to 5 years. And I think a lot of companies in the industry are going to see the same sort of effect, certainly. Obviously, as I mentioned, regulators are really struggling with this issue, not just in terms of funding for things like the Green Deal, but just in generally, things like CSRD reporting are going to demand increasingly some level of understanding around Scope 3. And then, and I think this gets to something that goes beyond just Scope 4, but there is value in transparency, right? For those of you who are not aware with it, there's a new standard out there called the UN Sustainable Development Performance Indicators, and one of the things that it puts forward is the idea that messaging around sustainability needs to be contextualized and authentic, right? And this gets to the heart of the greenwashing problem that we have, not just in our industry, but across the industry as a whole. And that's why you see terms like carbon neutral or climate neutral being eventually banned, right? Because they're not transparent and they're not contextualized and they're not authentic. And so I think more and more Scope 3 will be a way for companies to say, look, we've got challenges, there's things we need to get better at, and we're going to have a very authentic messaging and strategy around how we communicate that information. So in terms of the operational landscape, and this is a bit of an eye chart, so I won't go into it to detail, I think it's really meant to show that there are a lot of different touch points and intersection points within the IT infrastructure industry and that create challenges around who owns what, right? This is from a new strategy guidance document from the Uptime Institute, which I would highly recommend. It raises some really important new topics into the conversation. And they also have some training. I was talking to Thomas downstairs, who's at a table, brilliant guy. So definitely worth talking to them about this. But I think just taking as an example, you've got a colo provider who sells space to a hyperscaler who provides a service to a software as a service company who has an end customer. Who owns Scope 2? Who owns Scope 3, right? Just in that simple one scenario, and then you multiply that by all the different potential scenarios where either financial control or operational control isn't really clear. And the GHG protocol and the way reporting is set up now is those things have to be clear. And a company has to determine whether or not their system boundary for reporting is based on financial control or operational control. It's just one example. So if you haven't gone down that path, then you're going to get stuck right there, and then you have to go back to the finance people and the legal people and say, well, how do we do this? Are we looking at finance? Do we control the machines? And then if it's operational control, well, does that mean I have to actually be the one who maintains the machines? Do I own them? If it's financial control, is it a lease where it's a financial lease, or is it a capital asset to my business? Will determine whether or not you have financial control. So lots of complexity in that area. Operators are concerned around not just the cost of infrastructure and operations, but the cost of carbon accounting. Because you have all these things like a border adjustment mechanism, a cost of carbon, it's going to become a real accounting problem and a real challenge when you're paying, whatever it is, $100 a ton or something like that. John, you probably know this number off the top of your head, but I'm not far off, right? And that's going to become a big issue. And if there's not clarity, it's going to be like the generally accepted, accounting principles. Everybody's just kind of winging it. It's not really going to work. So we're going to have to figure this out and agree as an industry how this all works. And right now, there's not a lot of people doing that, right? So there's only a handful of people in the industry who are reporting Scope 3 at this point. And these numbers are going to change as a result of regulation, but it's actually gone, if in the last couple of years, in the wrong direction. Right, and I think part of it is people kind of freaking out about what's going to happen, and am I going to look worse, and am I doing it right, and all these other issues. So, with that, I think we'll just start with the first question on there, right? What aspects of this are you all most concerned about?
So we just completed the workshop at Datacloud ESG in Oslo called, pardon me, is that your carbon or mine? Focused on separating Scope 2, Scope 3 carbon, figuring out whose carbon is whose. It was really an interesting discussion. These are the panelists kind of reflecting on the workshop itself.
I think there were a lot of topics that we got to discuss that were really, maybe not mind-blowing, but it opened up a few things for me that I thought were interesting to take away. I think one of the main points for me was, I think we're all coming from engineering backgrounds and everybody wants the data to be so accurate. So when we had representatives from the supply chain mentioning that they don't want to report because they are not reporting as accurate as they would like, and that's an issue for them. But the people receiving the data, they're going, well, why don't you just do your best and we'll help you get there. And I think that conversation hasn't really been held in a two-way street where we help each other get more accurate data.
And the tension in the room between the suppliers and the purchasers, and they weren't specific suppliers and purchasers. They were free to sort of complain and sort of voice their, it's right. Like, why don't you all do this or X or Y? It was really interesting, and how as you said, the expectations on the accuracy of the data and how long it takes to do, and really interesting, a lot of energy in the room.
And I think it became very obvious that nobody has all the information, so you have to work together. There's that's just an absolutely, that became very, very obvious very quickly, didn't it? I thought as well that, it always comes home to roost, this very layered nature of the data centre as a facility and the multitude of sort of contractual arrangements that can exist with that. Yeah. It's not just a Scope 3 problem, it's actually really tricky working out who's, the Scope 2. Yeah. And I just thought, gosh, this is such enormous complexity. And I think the other thing that I think I was very conscious of is, and that was in all these, is the need for maybe not accuracy, but some form of third-party validation. And the sense that we're all on a journey and we're actually at quite an early stage of that journey. I think we just have to accept that. So I think that came out really clearly.
But I think the fear of being wrong and the consequences of being wrong make it so if we're talking about how it was inscribed in contract, right? So now if you're putting a RFQ, you would like someone to be able to demonstrate Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and that's part of your contract. Not too sure you want to be the worst performing Scope 1, Scope 2, because they maybe won't take you. But maybe you're worst performing because in fact you've got all the data that everybody else hasn't managed or are maybe brave enough to put it into a context that you are happy to put it publicly. A lot of people disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 because they know 99% of it is right. Yeah. Hardly anybody discloses. And it was in the slides, right? 22% or 28% because it's difficult to be wrong.
But also the assumption, you have to be confident that whoever's looking at that is going to look at it qualitatively, because the number doesn't tell you anything. The bigger the number, probably the more high quality your information is.
Probably right.
And that's the problem, that you can look bad but be good, because actually it just means that you've been more thorough. And so unless you've got full confidence that whoever's reviewing that is not going to say, oh, that's a high number, count them out. That's not how it works. It's all about having that qualitative review. So I think that's, again, I completely agree with you on that fear of putting yourself out there.
Yeah, and if you're going to get compared to someone based on this, that's when people get really nervous, right? Because if you're, we have this with hyperscalers, one reports scope 3 and the other doesn't. If someone wants to compare them at a product level, you can't really do that, right? Just because the number is going to be radically different. And it's not to say, that the scope 3 number that's being reported by one of them is super accurate, right? They're just going down that path of doing that, probably trying to create momentum and engagement with their supply chain. But as a supplier to all of them, right, we struggle with the same sorts of things. We can't do things like product level reporting with certain types of IT infrastructure. It's just not feasible because they're shared service platforms, and they're in the exact same boat. Only they're trying to go even further. They're trying to do things like product level reporting, right, which is really, really hard. So I think there's the companies that are really pushing the industry forward and trying to do scope 3 and trying to do things like product level reporting deserve a lot of support. And at the same time, they're some of the most well-resourced companies. So we have to ask them also for their support for the rest of the supply chain and kind of to fund some of these things.
But the funny part is that even if they're reporting, but they're not working with the supply chain, then how are they reporting? This is the question, right? Because, I mean, if I'm sitting at the top of the supply chain and I'm going, this is my scope 3, but I have no interaction with all the way down my supply chain, where did I get the data from? Did I estimate it? Are we talking, and most people, let's face it, there's databases, and I think that's better than not doing it, but how accurate it is, it's questionable.
You're right. I've been talking to this organization called GIST, which is one of the big databases, right? And we've compared some of their data to supplier data, and they have a legitimate argument to say their data is probably more accurate, right? Because they're looking at it from a different perspective. The supplier has an interest in the number being lower, of course, so, and nothing against the supplier, because they're also trying to be accurate and credible, but they have an interest in it being lower, where a third party can come in and say, if you look across an industry and come up with an average, then anybody who who's in that industry but doesn't have data, you should apply this to them. And then of course that gives, if they're better than their industry average, that gives them the incentive to then go and do it, right?
I thought another interesting point was about having data that's anonymous and how you can leverage that. So if you were to look at a data center end to end and have people put in anonymous data about their emissions, then you kind of get rid of the problem. However, to then control that is the next issue, right? And often you would want to know who it does come from in the end. So maybe it's not feasible, but I think that's an interesting point, and how you can anonymize it.
Yeah.
But we could probably learn from other industries that already take, like think about medical records, or a lot of information is gathered and then it can be used to diagnose, but you don't necessarily put a name to the condition. You just take maybe characteristics of, and I think one of the people participating spoke about how they'd done the kind of the classification of data. Everything went into the calculator, so you validated the means by which you calculate. And that could be something that people can sit around the table and discuss. Yes, that's accurate. Yes, we agree with that. And then each person drops in the data, and you just take out the piece that you need.
And then potentially you might not be as scared, because for another example that was brought up in the discussion was, you provide something that has a material within your own product that creates more emissions, but it will help you save emissions somewhere else. But if you look at the entire chain there, then maybe that isn't an issue. Then you don't have to be afraid to disclose your data, because it's not viewed as your individual contribution. It's viewed as the entire value chain.
Yeah, we're at such early days in all this, and it's so massively complex. It'll be a mess for a while.
It's already a mess.
Sums it up really well.
And a data center is a system, right? And that, to that kind of point of, if ideally we'd be able to say in a systems thinking way, okay, here's how we're going to approach this and address, but that's not the way it actually functions, right? It functions as a bunch of discrete parties that are supplying things like cables and conduit and whatever, who all have a particular interest. And we're not yet at that stage where we have a standard that says, okay, this is how the system is designed, and here's the ideal design, here's a sustainable design for a data center, with all these different variables, because it's such a complex thing. But I think ultimately that to have all these standards, we have to have at least some kind of framework or reference for what that is, so that those people who are making, the conduit that means you don't need shielding, or shielding that, I don't forget which way it worked, can legitimately go and make this argument to people who are designing data centers, and that becomes a part of the dialogue that we're all having. Well, I thought that was super fascinating when they said that, because it's just something that had never occurred to me.
But then it goes back to then there's a requirement for education around this, right? Or people understanding, so the decision maker. So because I think someone threw in the conversation, well, the procurement person is just going to go cost, possibly availability, because that's the parameters that we measure it now. And then if we throw in the factor, I know at least in organization, we're trying to visualize the cost of carbon with things, but that's complex as well. To what extent do you go? So I think that there's a piece of those making the decisions need to understand how it fits in the overall system that you're referring to as well. Yeah.
And what's the weighting, right? Like we get RFPs that say, oh, we really care about sustainability, but it's only public entities at this point that are giving you any sort of clear indication around what the weighting is for sustainability factors. Or organizations like the BBC is starting to do it now, right? But they're quasi-public entity. But a private company that doesn't, they say it's really important, but they don't tell you how important relative to other things, leaves the supplier in a situation where they're trying to guess, okay, do I increase costs in my proposal for the sake of delivering a more sustainable solution or not? And I think that kind of clarity needs to come into the supply chain so all these companies can make those decisions.
I think it's really interesting to think about what are our next steps then as this group after this workshop. We collected all the names of the people, the participants. There was clearly so much energy, and I think one of our challenges is going to be to leverage that energy, keep people engaged, but figure out something concrete that we can do together to move it forward. I wonder if any of you have any ideas on how to, one, organize it, and two, how do we get this done, and what are the topics that'll...
Bite-sized chunks.
Yeah. How do you eat an elephant,
Yeah, I mean, going back to kind of that original ask from the ITU and GeSI about getting the iMasons community to contribute something to this, what's a document that's literally a version 0.1 rather than a version 1, right? It's still very early days. But I think that if we could use that at least as a framework to say, look, these kind of standards are credible and they're being put forward, and organizations like the ITU and GeSI do actually influence changes in the GHG protocol and how those things work, right? So if you want to have a voice being a part of organizations like this, and iMasons is going to give you the opportunity to have your voice be heard in that, maybe that's a way to get people motivated to participate.